Working with technology here, so I have to let this thing warm up again. So, give you a little introductory information as we wait for the projector to recycle. I got appointed in September to go out to NIST. I forget the name, and they have everything that NIST has about long as far as the name. It was a technical committee anyway to review their draft, their report. I kind of view it as like a peer review. They invited a bunch of experts. I still don't know how I got invited, but they were looking for experts across the country to review what they had come up with on the World Trade Center issue and provide them feedback on how they could make the report better, or if they missed anything or overlooked anything or should have done something a little better. So I actually was represented NFPA because I'm the committee chair on one of their committees, and that's how I got involved. So I want to thank publicly both NFPA and my boss, State Fire Marshal Jerry Rosendahl, for allowing me that opportunity. It was a wonderful experience. It really fit in well with me because I have an interest in two things that were directly related to the World Trade Center. One is how fires, or how buildings behave in fire conditions. I've always found that fascinating, and there was probably not a better thing to study than this. The second thing is I have an interest in aviation, and especially commercial aviation and jets and airlining and all that kind of stuff. And so this was kind of the perfect fit for me. So let me try this again here and see if we're going to recycle. A couple of questions here before we get started is, how many of you were ever in the World Trade Center before 9/11? 2? Okay, 3? And the other question is, how many of you watched this whole thing unfold on TV on the day of 9/11? All right, pretty much everybody. I think pretty much the whole country. I think that's what catapulted the news networks into being anything other than that. They were down there with the ratings of public television and two others. Just a little bit of background information. Some things that we found out. One is I remember watching that, and I was with about 6 of my coworkers at the time, and watching that thing unfold, and I believed that it was going to come down. That was my impression. I thought it was going to do this. I thought it was going to do that, probably towards the side it was hit, much like a tree comes down and you're chopping it down. In retrospect, it was probably a very good thing that it experienced the pancaking collapse. Believe it or not, that probably saved some people's lives. If it hadn't toppled like this, it would have toppled 2 or 3 blocks over on buildings that were fully occupied. So in retrospect, believe it or not, even though there were almost 3,000 people killed, it was probably a good thing. The interesting thing, and I point this out a little later in the presentation, none of the firefighters from New York that were interviewed after that, and they interviewed several hundred, Nisja as part of this, none of the firefighters there envisioned collapse as even a remote possibility. For some of you that have a fire service background, that was not even in their thought process that could even remotely happen. Now there's some reasons for that. Some of the old timers in the fire department had been through the Empire State Building that got hit by a B-25. If they hadn't been there, at least they'd heard of it. And a lot of the firefighters had experienced the 1993 bombings. Buildings didn't do that, they did this. And then just the obvious thing, it didn't go over when it initially hit. So, a lot of people thought, well, it will be okay. See if you can work the magic here. That's what I had the problem with last time. I'm trying to get the screen a little wider here. There we go. Thank you.
One more time, or are you happy with that?
No, that should be good. That should be good. Kind of the unusual thing is, prior to this time, there was really no federal agency that investigated these types of things. Yeah, OSHA would come in if it was a worker issue, and the fire administration could do some things, but they had to steal from their budget to do it, and they do it but kind of on a voluntary basis. So there really was no government agency to look at these things after they happened. So about a year after 9/11, I think it was October 2002, Congress passed the National Construction Safety Team Act, and put NIST in charge of it. Now, is everybody here familiar with NIST? Who's familiar with NIST here? Hopefully. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's an agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce. They do all kinds of things. There's lots of scientists there. There's lots of people running around with pocket protectors with pens in them, and these people talk like they're from another planet. They're extremely intelligent. I don't mean to make fun of them, because they're not at all. I have the utmost respect for them. But they have what's called the Building and Fire Research Laboratory, which is one of their larger branches or divisions. They are within the Department of Commerce, and their primary goal is to figure out ways to make things more cost-effective, to stimulate commerce, to do all those kinds of things. So it's kind of a weird place for a fire agency to be, but they've got some wonderful scientists. They do things like keep the atomic clock and all that kind of stuff. And, but they were appointed to be the National Construction Safety Team. Now they have done three, kind of 2.5 major fire investigations. The World Trade Center was the first one they tackled, and that was the whole reason that the law got passed by Congress. The other one that they did, the half one I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but the other major one that they did is the Station Nightclub in Rhode Island in 2003. Those reports, both these reports are held. So at the bottom of your handout, I have a website address. For any of you that are having trouble sleeping at night, feel free to go there. You can download all these reports. Just to show you, this one is kind of their summary. That's the summary. And this is the smallest of the 8. If you get it, if you download it, please don't hit print in your printer, because that's like Encyclopedia Britannica. If you order the whole set, I think they're on 2 CD-ROMs. It's huge. Okay, they've done a lot of things. All right. One of the interesting things I found out when I was there was that the first thing NIST had to do, and if you find this strange, bear with me, the first thing NIST had to do was prove that airplanes hit the building. Because there was a very large conspiracy theorist out there that President Bush ordered a military strike and implosion of these buildings so that he could therefore invade somewhere. And that everything we saw from CNN and ABC and CBS and everything else coming over TV was being fed by the federal government, and the networks were just patsies. Believe it or not. So NIST had to spend, the first thing was they had to spend a fair amount of time documenting that this incident that we all saw unfold live actually happened. So it's just like we never landed on the moon and all that other stuff. So that just blew me away that they even had to waste any time with that. But that was the first thing to document that the World Trade Center really had airplanes flying in. So anyway, some of the basis of the whole thing is any NIST investigation is considered fact-finding, not fault-finding. As a matter of fact, as part of the federal law, none of their findings can be used in any litigation. So it's the nice thing about that then is that you don't get held up with any orders, and that's one of the things. NFPA's been sitting on a report for almost 3 years now on the Station Nightclub, and it's under subpoena from the Rhode Island Attorney General. They can't release it. That's the one thing. As soon as NIST does it, it's out there, and they don't get tied up in any state or federal litigation on it, which is really nice. So first thing is that they weren't there to find fault. They were there to find fact, kind of lessons learned concept. They want to know why the progressive collapse occurred. Maybe another name for progressive collapse is disproportionate collapse, and that's really where one structural element fails, causing another structural element to fail, causing another one to fail, and the domino effect. So that was kind of the basis. They want to know, could anything have prevented the loss of life? The other thing that they're very clear on is their investigation was never intended to make buildings plane-proof. Some people say, oh, they want to, have a building be able to withstand an airplane. No, that was never the intent behind it. The cost of that would be so prohibitive, it's just totally unrealistic. So, but could this building have withstood a longer period of time? And at the end of this, I think you'll come away with the idea of yes, it could have. with some relatively minor changes to it. A little bit of history. It was designed from 1962 to 1964. The formal groundbreaking was in 66 and began construction in 68. First occupied in 70, obviously like the typical high-rise, you're kind of turning it over in pieces, So there was probably occupancy happening in the lower floors before the upper floors were even done. Tower number 1 was 1,368 feet tall, which is about 6 feet taller than tower 2. Geez, can't even get it right at 1,400 feet. You're off a couple inches. The tower footprint was 210 feet per side, and they were each basically square. And for all practical purposes, at least from the outside, they looked identical. There's actually several buildings on the World Trade Center complex. For those of you who are familiar with it, but we have the 2 twin towers, 1 and 2. They had a Marriott hotel. It's about 22 stories, gone. 9-story office building, gone. World Trade Center 5, gone. Custom House, part of that survived, but not real good. And World Trade Center 7, that's the half a report that I was talking about that NIST has, because they've also done the subsequent report on World Trade Center 7. Bit of trivia, that came down about 4 o'clock in the afternoon as a result of the other towers coming down. You didn't even hear it, a 47-story tower collapsed. And it didn't even make the news. So I mean, it was just so overshadowed by the other 2 towers. So this is what the complex, the site looked like. There's the 2 towers, and this is the Marriott in between. This is 7 that we talked about, and essentially everything here was destroyed. A lot of these other buildings within a block were heavily damaged. Some of them were the old style, true. The Minneapolis City Hall kind of building, that's just, and some of them survived fairly well, but most of these were more modern construction and they didn't do so well. There was 4 different components that held the building together, much like many high-rises. You had the core, and for those of you unfamiliar with high-rise construction, that's very typical that the core supports the building. The exterior walls are typically not load-bearing in a high-rise. They're just curtain walls and they kind of hang on a skeleton. But the core supports the majority of the building. This building was a little unusual because they had exterior wall panels that were in fact load-bearing. We'll spend a little time talking about that. There was also a floor truss system, and they also had what's called a hat truss, and I'll describe what that is in a little bit. So the core was 135 feet by 87 feet. It consisted of 47 columns. The 4 corner columns on that supported about 20% of the total weight of the building. So they handled a disproportionate amount of the weight for this whole thing. The core itself was square tubular steel for the lower stories. About the 80th to 86th, depending on which tower you were in, they transitioned to white flange columns, or basically vertical I-beams to support the upper stories. Square tube where they had the most weight, and then they transitioned to I-beams for the upper part of it because they had bear less weight. Okay, here's the 2 towers. This is how they were configured. They're identical, right? What's different? One, you notice that it's parallel, one it's perpendicular. This is actually a major factor, maybe. You'll see where this comes into play on why they collapsed. Some of the things that I recall, and of course I've been watching it on TV like everybody else, and they're forever switching cameras and angles, and you don't know you don't really know what you're looking at, but I thought, geez, I think it was the second tower that got hit that collapsed first. Why is that? That was just unusual to me. Aside from the pancaking that I personally never expected to happen. There's some reasons for that, and we'll go through this as we go through the presentation. This is kind of what a typical configuration looked like in the tower. Most floors did not have these separate rooms. It was intended as a wide open, true open office plan, so almost anywhere that you were sitting, you could look out at least 2 long walls and look outside over the, over the river and everything else out into New York Harbor. But this is the core, and these are the 4 major columns on the corner of the core. Now, just in looking at this, if you've gone through any egress classes, does anything jump out with people? there's a stair, there's a stair. This is only a convenience stair between 2 stories. It was not present throughout the building.
Too close.
Not remote, too close together. Okay, this became a major factor in this incident that we'll talk about later on. The exterior wall panels were vertical square tubes, 14 inches per side in this tube, so it's about a foot square. There's 59 of them on each face of the towers. The space between the columns was about 26 inches wide. That got infilled with windows. Okay. Now, when you saw this thing on TV or whatever, it looked shiny, okay? And that's because they covered it with aluminum for aesthetic purposes, and the aluminum would then, bounce the color of the sky or whatever off of it. So you got some really neat colors off of it. These came in 3-story tall panels, and they were all bolted together, kind of like the old Tinker Toy set or whatever. Somewhat unusual, which you don't often see in construction, each panel was individually numbered, which really helped in the reconstruction because they actually went back and said, oh, this is panel 1A and this is panel 1B, and this, from this, whatever it was, 20-story mass of metal that they had after everything collapsed. And they were actually able to put it together again in some fashions. So this is what the exterior wall panels look like. This is that about square foot tube that I talked about. And then there was a plate that went across, and the trusses sat on that. And here's the other story, and there's another story. And then the glass got filled in here. And then the outside of this got coated with the aluminum. And that's what you saw that gave it kind of a unique appearance. This is what it looked like when it was done. They did some fireproofing in there also around the steel columns. The floor system was 4-inch lightweight concrete over a fluted steel decking.
Just pretty thin.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, not much, but the goal here, because they had such a tall building, was to get rid of as much weight as you could. Because that weight is all, load bearing. They wanted to get rid of as much weight as it could. On top of that, or the concrete was poured on top of lightweight steel bar trusses. The top bends of the trusses actually extended about 3 inches above the top cord. What they really did is kind of formed a knuckle. If this were your plate and the bar joist actually stuck above that, then they poured the concrete on top, so it became like a composite sandwich all together, which helped give it a lot of strength. It's not just having concrete on top of steel. It was all a big composite sandwich. So those floor trusses were either 35 or 60 feet long. That also became a major factor in the collapse that I'll show you a little later. And they were spaced about 6 feet 8 inches apart with bridging trusses between them. So this is what it looked like when it was, you had the bar joists, the knuckles that stuck up, the concrete was poured over it, there was a metal deck, and then they're tied together with these bridging trusses. This is, I'm going to get into an area that I'm not real familiar with. I'm going to touch on a little bit of structural engineering. I know nothing about structural engineering. I can prove that in court. But I learned a little bit about it, so we'll touch on it a little bit. If you're familiar with high-rise buildings, what's one of the major things you have to consider when you're building a high-rise building? Wind. These buildings have to move. So you can't have a solid member between here and here when your whole building has to move a little bit. So they would, on the upper side of this floor truss assembly, they'd anchor that to the outside wall, but of course in the bottom they don't, because this thing has to move a little bit. So they had what's called the damping unit, which was like a big shock absorber, and it would sit in there and just kind of absorb those movements. Right? Bit of trivia, this was made by 3M. We have a little Minnesota connection. They made those damping units that were in there. But this is kind of how the truss system looked like, and this went from the core over here to the outside walls over there. Those exterior panels that we showed. So this is kind of what it looked like when it was being put together. You have the outside wall assemblies and the floor truss assemblies. You see the knuckles sticking up. They haven't poured the concrete on it yet. That's kind of what it looked like. And of course, you saw those things after the collapse. You see those vertical things sticking up in all those pictures, and that's what it was. They had what's called a hat truss on top of it. It's located from 107th story to the top of the building. Originally intended to support a roof-mounted antenna. Only one of the two towers had an antenna on it, but they had designed both of them to have radio or TV antennas on it. I think actually they were too high to be effective because they have a shadowing effect with an antenna, so they never really got used as much as they thought they'd be. What this did, though, is it connected all these vertical columns and all the inside core columns were all tied together with this hat truss. So as you started to have some structural failures in the building, the hat truss actually transferred loads up across the top of it and down to the other side. Kind of like, you know, you kick out one leg, but there's four of them there, so the other three kind of pick it up. That's one of the things that happened. So they think for quite a while into it, it played a fairly significant role in redistributing the loads within the building. So this is a schematic of what it looked like. I mean, it's just a mass, a gangway on steel. But it connected all those outside columns and the inside columns together to kind of make one big, strong building. This building had fires in it before, obviously. In 1975, it had a fairly significant fire in it. I think New York had experienced a couple other fires about the same time in high-rises. At that time, they passed what was called Local Law 5, which basically required that buildings be high-rises be sprinkled, or they had to compartment them so much that I think they had to compartment them into 7,000 square foot chunks or something. And of course, that would have destroyed this open office look. So World Trade Center says, I think we'll retrofit sprinklers. So somewhere in about the late 70s, they started retrofitting the buildings. They were totally done. Well, they were done by the time of the 93 incident, and they were certainly done by 2001. There were fire department standpipes in the stairwells at each floor. They had inside water supply, 20,000 gallons of stored water, 3 fire pumps in each building. Now this is another area, I apologize for, you know, the graphics are pretty small, there's a lot of information. I apologize for this. Somebody like Steve Zackert or Marty Bates would be much more familiar with a high-rise sprinkler design. I've never been involved in one, but they had water tanks up there. They would feed certain floors. They would be zoned. You'd have a low zone, a medium zone, and a high zone. And, you know, it wasn't all fed. Well, it's fed from the same one, but you wouldn't get your supply there. You pump up and then you let gravity take over. And so it was a fairly complex system, and then they were interconnected from tower to tower so that if the pump went down in one, they could use the pump in the other one to augment it. So it was a fairly complex system. The one bad thing is that there is basically a common riser, kind of the standpipe stair towers were kind of a common riser, and when that got destroyed, they lost all the fire protection also. Of course, once a 6-inch pipe was ruptured, it's just, you know, it's just wide open water flowing. So, the fire alarm system had been replaced following the 1993 bombing. The terrorists in '93 actually, I don't know if they were that smart, but they actually planted that bomb in about the best place they could when they drove the truck in there. They put it right next to the electrical service and the fire command center that was in the basement in the common area, and they took that out. So that took out not only the electrical supply, it took out the emergency generator that was right next to it, and the fire command center. So they really did some pretty serious damage to that. When they had replaced that fire alarm system, they went to separate fire command posts, the fire command centers, one in each tower, with the ability to switch over from one to the other. So you could run the whole building from one or the other, or you could run them separately, whichever. They had what they call a smoke purge system. It was manually activated. It was primarily for stair smoke removal. It was pretty archaic by today's standards. You know, it was just a manual thing you turned on and kind of belched some smoke out, but kind of not really. And you know, its effectiveness was very, very limited during the incident. It didn't even seem to work very well in the 93 incident. So. The core columns were encased in gypsum, once again to save weight. They didn't want to go concrete there, so a lot of the core was designed with gypsum. The trusses, the exterior columns, and everything else had a spray-applied fire-resistant material. I didn't want to retype that every time, so I just use that acronym SFRM. It's spray applied fire resistant material. And then one place, in your handouts there actually may be a typo on that, but that's what it is. And then tenants were separated by a 1 hour demising wall, basically 5/8 of gypsum on steel studs. Went from floor to roof deck above. The original specifications called for 1 inch thick. Oh, let me back up a little bit. The early part of the World Trade Center, the spray applied fire resistant material was the A word. About a third of the way through the project, they transitioned to non-asbestos based products. So, I can't remember the name of it, but it was one of the commercial products. It's more lightweight cementous type mixture that they had on there. The original specs called for 1 inch. Somewhere in the design, the Port Authority directed that 1/2 inch be used. Nobody knows quite where the disconnect came between 1 inch and 1/2 inch. But then again, this is the late 60s, and by today's standards, we were probably pretty primitive with a lot of fire testing and listings and all that kind of stuff. After the '93 bombing, the Port Authority began replacing that fireproofing on the steel, and they upgraded it to 1.5 inches, which gave them a true 2 hour listing on all those. There was no documentation that the 1 inch ever would have even given them a true listing. Certainly the 1/2 inch didn't. So this is what it looked like. This is a photo taken in '93 after the bombing. As you can see, it's not very evenly applied. A lot of places it's bare steel. So this became a major factor in the investigation and under why the towers collapsed. This is what it looked like after they had retrofitted the floor and done it correctly. Now, and Gordon, you probably do deal with this. You know, they didn't do this unless they basically turned over the whole floor. So they would have to vacate.
Because of the asbestos.
Because of the asbestos and the whole, just the abatement process. So until they got a whole floor, a whole tenant would turn over and get a whole floor, would they do this? A lot of these high-rises, they would have 6 or 8 tenants on the floor, trying to get all the leases to coincide. So this was going to be a long, long process to get this done. And it was not something that was going to happen overnight. I don't even know how many of the floors had been converted. They really can't figure that out. Believe it or not, you're like this, most of the plans were in the basement. Oops. The stairs and elevator shafts were 2 inch thick cast gypsum panels and covered with 2 or 3 layers of gypsum wallboard on each side of steel studs. It was possibly, maybe even probably equivalent to a 2 hour resistive assembly, but it had never been tested. There was no listing. There was no documentation that anyone had ever submitted it for any testing or listing. There's even some speculation that it was never supposed to be that. Whatever, that's what it was. It's just kind of, so, we went through that one already. There were 98 passenger elevators in each tower. The elevators used what's called the sky lobby concept. In other words, you didn't get on the main floor and say, I want to go to floor 77. You would go to an intermediate floor and get off and then take local elevators that handled that 30 stories or so. So you couldn't take one elevator from here to 99th floor. You would always have to get off and switch. And they did that primarily to gain space because they were actually able to stack one elevator shaft on top of another elevator shaft. And actually have more elevators, but minimize the space that would be used. They had 8 additional freight elevators in each tower. They all had been upgraded to fire service operations. So this is kind of how it looked like. Like here, you'd go in on the main level and you take it up to this level, and then you jump on a local one and take it up the rest of the way. So you never had one elevator ride. You always had a couple to get where you were going inside the building. And you can see they could just vertically stack them then without losing a lot of space. They had 3 stairs located in the core. This is a photograph actually of during the incident that somebody took coming down. Often wondered if that firefighter is even alive today. May have been the last time anyone saw him alive. Two of them were 44 inches wide, one was 56 inches wide. The unusual thing is the stairways were not vertically continuous. Now, once again, I don't have a lot of experience in high-rise buildings, but you actually had to leave the stair shaft and go out into what they call the transfer hallway, and then you'd come back in. Do you guys have any of those?
A couple of them.
Yeah. Okay. This became a major impediment during the incident because people, after you've gone down a number of stairs, you're kind of going, I don't know where I am anymore. I mean, and it kind of like all of a sudden you're forced to go out a door and you go, am I all the way to the bottom yet? And seeing as most people never took the stairs in the building, you never took the stairs, you always took elevators, so they got really confused, and this transfer hallway was a contributing factor to delay in evacuation, and people getting all mixed up, where am I? And now I'm out in this corridor, I thought I was in a stairway, and what's going on? So the descent time was slowed to about 1 story per minute during the actual evacuation. There was a lot of smoke and structural damage encountered. Then those transfer hallways that I talked about, mobility impaired occupants really slowed things down. I mean, you're going down a stair and the person in front of you is going slow, you're going slow. You just don't have any choice. You're only as fast as the slowest person. There were physical challenges of just going down 80 or 90 stories. Just, unless you're in reasonably good shape, that's a big deal. A lot of people suffer dehydration, so they go out of the stairs, go into one of the floors to try to find a drink of water, just so that they could continue, evacuating the building. So, and then you had the counterflow of emergency responders, the firefighters trying to go up. And I just say, understand, I was a firefighter for 8 years, so I really can't even relate to this. I'd like to say I can relate to this. The standard high-rise pack for New York City Fire Department is 140-inch-and-a-half holes for the standpipe bundle and an SCBA air tank with a spare bottle clip here and an axe or a forcible entry tool. So for any of you that have ever tried that, that is a lot of weight to carry. Weight to carry. And some of them, they did have a report that one of them made it, I think, as far up as the 55th floor of one of them. This was one of the firefighters that was a marathon runner. Typically, they found the occupants didn't initiate evacuation for 3 to 5 minutes after the incident. So, what's going on? Is this real? And actually, that's not that unusual. You'll find that in a lot of buildings. Well, until I get some more information that this is really something, I'm not doing anything.
Did they get conflicting instructions as well?
In Tower 2, they did, yes.
Yeah, that's
Tower 2, they did, but even Tower 1, after that thing was hit, and everybody in that building knew something was going on. And still, for 3 to 5 minutes after the fire alarm was activated, they didn't necessarily do anything. Now, I just looked this up in the S&P handbook, and typical office building descent speed is about 0.5 meter per second. So about a little over 3.5 stories per minute. The rule of thumb they give you is 1 story for every 15 seconds. So, and this is this is what they kind of consider ideal or optimum conditions. And you saw that this was already at 4 times that. So
that's like running down the stairs.
That's actually, I timed myself doing this, and you're moving, but you're not running.
No.
It's kind of going down at a pretty decent speed, but once again, there's nobody in a wheelchair in front of you or anything. I mean, you're going down, and that's holding onto a rail and not running. But yeah, you can find that in the S&P handbook. So take a look at the incident itself. Typically, they estimated that there would be 20,000 people in each of the 2 towers. Now, like a lot of high-rise buildings, they had a fairly sophisticated system in terms of security. So you had to be scanned, like with your employee ID card, or if you were a visitor there, you had to sign in and all this kind of stuff. So under a typical day, under typical conditions, they had a pretty good idea how many people were in the building at any given time. And unfortunately, once again, that was all in the computer in the building, which was, now in the New Jersey junk pile somewhere, if you could even resurrect it. So they really don't know exactly how many people. They have a fairly good estimate. But, however, 9/11 was the first day of school in New York City. So if anybody in this room is a parent, you can probably relate to this. Being the first day of school, especially with younger kids, it's kind of like, well, I'm going to be a little late. So actually that was one thing that worked out to the benefit. It was also primary election day. So a lot of people had stopped on their way to work to vote. So the actual number of people in there was substantially lower than it would have been later on in the day. The other thing that happened is this was about 8:45 in the morning, 10 to 9 in the morning, when the first power got hit. For those of you who have been on, anybody here worked on the East Coast? I know you kind of have. Right? They have a different schedule in the Midwest just because of their location and the time zones. So a more typical workday in New York or Boston, it starts at 9 o'clock as opposed to 8 o'clock that we have here in the Midwest. I'm not saying everyone does, but you know, 9 to 5 is a typical workday in New York City. So unlike here where that building would have been fairly well occupied at 9 in the morning, in there it wouldn't have been, because that's just when people were getting there to go to work. Plus the election, plus the first day of school. So there were not a lot of people there that day. 8:46 and 30 seconds, World Trade Center 1 was struck by a hijacked American Airlines Boeing 767-200 extended range. Has a wingspan of about 156 feet. I looked at that, that would slice the IDS right in half. I mean, that was one thing, this was wide enough that it was completely encased within the footprint of the building. It carried 183,000 pounds empty. They had 87 passengers, this one. The airlines knew exactly how many people were there and exactly who they were. So it's less than 50% full. Pay attention to that because the airlines will never now fly at 50% full. They aren't taking off at 50% full anymore. So the estimated weight was about 283,000 pounds. The aircraft passengers, contents and fuel, cargo and everything else in it. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a 767 would look like, this is it. You won't see many of those in Minnesota. Northwest does not fly them. So American and United are the two big carriers. Delta has a few of them. You just don't see them around here. I remember seeing one time when they had a big storm in Chicago and they diverted to Minneapolis. So United, I think, had one out at the tarmac at Minneapolis, St. Paul, but you won't normally see them. However, they are a sister to the 757. It's the exact same cockpit configuration. It's identical. The only thing is it stretches out and becomes wider and a little longer. And get more passengers in there. But if you can fly a 757, you can fly a 767. And the terrorists did that on purpose because one of the hijacked planes was a 757, one was a 767. They only had to learn one protocol, one airplane to fly, and it didn't matter which one gave you the most flexibility, so to speak. The aircraft was traveling about 440 miles an hour. It was banked about 25 degrees to left, so the right wingtip was up. I was descending at about a 10-degree slant. The nose of the aircraft struck the 96th floor and damaged from the 93rd to the 99th floor on the north face of that tower. This is a photograph of what it looked like. You can actually see the wingtips. You can see the engines. You can see where the fuselage was. You can even see where the tail went up. This is an enhanced photograph. NIST enhanced it. Kind of remove some of the smoke from it. Estimated there was 10,000 gallons of jet fuel on there. About 15% of it sprayed in a cloud inside the building. About another 15% burned outside the building in a huge fireball that most of you saw. About half of it remained unburned in the building. And some of the jet fuel entered the stairways and elevator shafts. One of the things the fire department encountered was a fireball coming down one of the elevator shafts. And there was also people slipping in the stairways because they were wet from jet fuel. So this is what World Trade Center 1 looked like shortly after being hit. What you're seeing over here, you can see some burning going on over there. Probably the most photographed and videotaped incident ever in history. And they reviewed like 68,000 photographs as part of NIST and 200 some hours of videotape. This, so they have it from every angle, I bet we wish the Kennedy assassination was this well documented other than the grainy Zapruder film, that everybody sees. But this is a damage inside World Trade Center 1. The airplane hit fairly well square there. Remember, it's at a little tilt, so that's why there's more wing damage here. These red ones were columns that were basically severed. The blue ones were not a whole lot better. The yellow ones were kind of okay. The green ones were pretty heavily damaged too. There's actually an opening here. The landing gear from the airplane went out here and was found about 2 blocks away on the street over here. It actually flew over a couple other buildings and landed on the street over there. So that's what the exit wound was in the opposing side of the building. This is showing the inward buckling at about 1023. You can actually see the skin is like crimped on the outside, this aluminum skin. NIST added the grid lines here following what should have been the columns, and I apologize because you can't see it real well in here, but at this point it's deviating 55 inches in. So 4.5 feet, it's pulled in on that wall. So, you know, in retrospect, anyone that would have looked at this and been paying attention at the time would go, that's something's going to happen here when you pulled in that far on the wall. Something has to give. This is actually now, where did we say that World Trade Center 1 got hit? What side?
North.
North. This is what's happening on the south side, right before the collapse, or shortly before the collapse. So this is on the opposite side. You'll see that this is where the majority of the fire is. Actually, what's happened, the planes hit it, huge fireball, no doubt, pushed all the combustibles into one area, and then just after that, the fire, they basically said the jet fuel was out within 10 minutes. What you saw burning the rest of the time was the ordinary combustibles at like 4 pounds per square foot. And because a lot of them were piled up on the opposite side because of the force of the impact, that's where it burned along this. Actually, this is where the collapse started. That's where the Boeing that you just saw on the last slide is actually on the opposite side, because this side took the heat for a longer period of time than the other side did. So that's why they fell opposite where they were hit, that's where the collapse started.
And the sprinkler system?
The sprinkler system was wiped out when it hit the core. The sprinklers and standpipes were obliterated. It took the 6-inch piping right out and they were done. The pumps probably ran, but once the tanks were empty, you know. I did figure out that if this ever happens to me, I want to be on the floor that the plane hits. And if I see a plane coming towards the building I'm in, I'm going to go to that floor, because I'd rather take it head on than take like some of the other people did living above that. They had time to think. And the people in the elevator shafts, a few of those did free fall. They had time to think. You know, kind of unpleasant. You know, at least if you took it head on, you know, you probably get it at the point of impact. Even the people in the plane that crashed out of Pennsylvania, they had time to know what was going on. That was not a fun day for a lot of people. World Trade Center 2 was struck by a hijacked United Airlines 767 carrying about 60 passengers, so it was less than 1/3 full. This plane was traveling about 100 miles an hour faster, however. It was doing 540 miles an hour, which is up against the upper limit of what a 767 can do. He was really smoking. He was banked about 38 degrees, so a lot bigger bank than the other one had, and was descending at about 6 degrees. The nose of that aircraft struck the 81st floor slab, head on into the floor. Substantial damage from the 77th to the 85th floor on the south face of the building. So one came at it this way into one tower, and one came at it that way into the other tower. It swayed because World Trade Center 1 was being photographed and videotaped at this time. So you saw the second plane hit it, and they were actually able to reproduce the photographs and see how much movement there was in Tower 2 when it got hit. It moved about 27 inches they were able to put on. Now, somewhat unusual, I'll do a little research on this here so I get my numbers right. That is well within the tolerance of most high-rise buildings. You typically look at standard structural engineering is somewhere in the 1 to 400 to 1 to 600 movement. So this was basically 1,400 feet high. So you would expect, the building was designed to absorb 2.5 to 3 feet of sway. So this was within the design parameters of the building yet. One of the things that NIST came out with is it depends, they were upset about this because it depended which code you were in, what the wind standards had to be, the wind loads had to be. And they said there's too much deviation. The Chicago code said one thing, the New York code said one thing, the Boca code said one thing. And they said we really need to standardize that to get to one because there are great deviations of what's tolerated. And nobody really has an answer for it. About half the occupants had left the floor within 5 minutes. Obviously, most of them were aware that something bad was happening in Tower 1. They felt that they'd heard it, they'd seen it on TV, they had phone calls. You know, they've now had 15, 16 minutes. About 3,000 of them had the opportunity to use the elevators in World Trade Center 2 before it got hit. So a lot of people had already left the building. This one, however, struck off-center. This is just before the point of impact. See, he's got a pretty good bank going on there. Now, what's another thing that you notice just by looking at the photograph? What's the difference between the two hits?
Lower.
It's lower. Now, why is that a factor?
More weight.
More weight. A lot more weight. Another 10 to 15 stories a week. So that's the point of explosion. This is how World Trade Center 2 was hit. It was off-center, like I talked about, and he actually hit the core parallel to it, as opposed to the other one that was hit perpendicular. Okay. He's hitting it parallel. On the one sense, it probably did less damage to the core. On the other sense, the damage it did was extremely critical. The other thing is now the fires are burning over in this area, underneath the long span trusses. In the other building, it was burning under the short span trusses. So these are about 35 feet, these are about 60 feet. Okay. So if you start getting sagging on these trusses, and they start sagging down 4 feet, that's going to pull in on the exterior wall. That's going to do a whole lot more damage than the shorter one that isn't going to be able to go down as far. So that was a major factor too, the fact that these were under the long span trusses as opposed to short span trusses. So this is shortly before the collapse of Tower 2. They've imposed this number of stories on here, and then also the column numbers. They've numbered all the columns going up the side of it. So here's kind of the timeline. The first plane hits 8:46, second one at 9:02, almost 9:03. Tower 2, the second one hit, collapses first, 56 minutes later. Tower 1 collapsed 102 minutes into the incident. When I've given this presentation to architects and structural engineers, I tell them, well, you know, one of the things I've always heard from people is that these hour ratings that we give to everything, you know, it's a 2-hour wall, it's a 1-hour wall, it's a 20-minute wall, whatever, cut them in half. And guess what? Pretty close. These were all supposed to be 2-hour rated assemblies, and they lasted, well, one lasted about an hour and one lasted an hour and 40 minutes. So I don't, if somebody says a 2-hour wall, it doesn't mean a whole lot to me. That doesn't mean it's going to last 2 hours in my mind. And in fact, it's pretty clear that it doesn't. If you can look, I don't know how well you can see it, but if you can look at the, when you look at the verticals here, you can see that one already leaning at the top. This is at the point that it started to go over. It actually started to tilt, and then it started the pancaking progressive collapse down onto itself. This is as it's going down, and this is the panic that was seen on the streets as it's going down. I'm going to try something here, and I'm not sure how well this is going to work because me and technology aren't getting along too well. But I've got a short video clip. I've got a video clip here, and I'm going to see if I can get it to run. It has not been user friendly today. Let's see what I can do.
The World Trade Center's and the unexpected force it would receive 3 decades later.
Unfortunately, my little thing didn't have to stay up in there.
It lurched back and forth. After maybe 6 to 10 movements back and forth of that building, it was over, and it was still standing.
In Robertson's design,
Robertson's
the
structure
downward weight of the
over here.
building was also supported by large steel columns around the building's inner core, which is where it placed elevator shafts, emergency stairs, and other building services. But the tall vertical columns of the inner core and the outer walls were like freestanding stilts until Robertson tied them together with floor trusses.
The World Trade Center is a very large project. In essence, it still boils down to a series of small pieces. And this is an example of a top-part assembly of a typical floor truss.
Long and thin, these horizontal steel assemblies were connected by bolts to the columns at each end, and then welded to the exterior columns for extra support. The trusses were critical for holding the buildings together, and their performance is now at the heart of the investigation into what happened. Robertson tried to save weight and costs wherever he could. He fireproofed all steel members, including the trusses, with the latest lightweight heat-resistant foam. And he kept the core area light by walling it off with drywall or sheetrock rather than concrete.
This is very typical. We often build buildings this way. 2 layers of sheetrock on either side of a steel framework. It's just like you might build a wall, except we use special sheetrock that's particularly fire resistant.
Although drywall is indeed effective at keeping fire at bay, it has one serious drawback that would reveal itself on September 11th. It's not very strong, especially when it's being heated. The designers of the Trade Center tried to anticipate every possible disaster. The towers were the first skyscrapers ever explicitly built to survive the impact of a plane.
We had designed a project for the impact of our largest airplane of its time, the Boeing 707. That is to take this jet airplane, run it into the building, destroy a lot of structure, and still have it standing.
When the World Trade Center was opened, there was little doubt these buildings were as safe as any skyscrapers in the world. Although they were initially criticized for their sterile industrial look, over time they worked their way into the hearts of New Yorkers and became one of the busiest spots in the city. But their very success made them a target. In 1993, Islamic extremists attacked the buildings for the first time. The terrorists exploded a huge bomb in a parking garage beneath the Trade Center complex. The blast blew a 90-foot hole through 5 floors of the underground structure, killing 6 people and sending soot and smoke racing through the building. But the towers stood firm.
The bombing, I think, created a lot of confidence in everyone's mind. The Trade Center was pretty sturdy.
The bombing did reveal at least one serious problem.
Remarkably, there was no study performed of the people evacuating in 1993. The evacuation time was something in the range of 1 to 7 hours, and you were in the building and what your visibility were.
After the attack, exit stairs were much improved, but no one really knew that people could evacuate the towers in less time than they had to. The test would come on September 11, 2001. On that day, British Transport Consultant Paul Neal was sitting at his desk on the 63rd floor of the North Tower.
The day was a beautiful, clear day, which I'm quite sure was significant because it meant that the hijackers of the aircraft would have perfect visual conditions so they'd be able to see those twin towers from 60, 70 miles away.
Down below in the World Trade Center's underground station, the morning rush hour was underway. It's now estimated that there were just 14,000 people in the two towers at that time in the morning. Far fewer than the 40,000 who would normally go down later in the day.
Ladder 6 only, box 215, 120.
A few blocks away, the Ladder 6 fire crew was going about its normal duties, when one of them heard the roar of aircraft engines.
We started pulling out quarters, and I distinctly remember hearing from the dispatcher, all Manhattan units respond to the World Trade Center.
Inside the stricken North Tower, just 10 floors beneath where the plane had hit, was commodities trader Bill Forney.
There was a high-pitched scream. There was a tremendous change in the air pressure. The building lurched forward, back and forth. It was a scary situation. It was actually the first time that I had truly ever thought that I might die.
The 767 that flew into the North Tower was larger than 707 and moving fast. It struck the building between the 93rd and 98th floors, instantly killing scores of people in the plane and tower. It also created a huge void across 6 floors on the impact wall. You can see the outline of the wingtip on the upper right. 2/3 of the supporting columns were completely severed, but the building stood firm.
What happened was that the loads that were being carried by those columns arched across the opening so that the columns adjacent to the hole now started picking up the loads that had been carried by those where the airplane went in.
Leslie Robertson's radical design seemed to have worked. But there was more devastating damage hidden inside. Although the
of the mass hitting the building, but none of us really focused on that kind of a fuel fire.
Initial reports described the fire as super hot due to the thousands of gallons of jet fuel carried by the plane. But the fire experts on the study team found those reports to be wrong.
The role of jet fuel, although it was hot, it only lasted a short period of time. It's very similar to using lighter fluid on a charcoal fire. It ignites the charcoal and then burns out. Its main role was to ignite other combustibles and really start the whole space burning at once.
The fuel served to flash start the fire on several floors instantaneously. And since sprinkler piping in the core was completely destroyed, there was no water to slow down the blaze. Even worse, when the core was struck, building's 3 emergency exits were also destroyed. So 950 people above the impact became trapped with no way out of the glowing inferno.
The people above, obviously they're suffering terribly, and people who collectively take their own destiny in their hands by jumping.
It now appears that people could not get past the crash area because the drywall used to protect the stairs had been blown off, leaving the staircases destroyed or in flames. One remarkable story illustrates just how weak the drywall was. The crash caused an elevator to jam between floors, trapping 6 people in the middle of the building.
If we don't get out of here, are we going to suffocate in here? Will we always move in here? I think a lot of thoughts just race through our mind at that particular moment.
They pried the doors open and found themselves facing drywall, which John Demscher attacked with nothing more than his window pane squeegee.
Whatever you have to try. Down in this particular time, it was not brick or concrete or something, there was drywall.
You take the handle of the squeegee, takes the rubber out to make the nuts to work with. I focus on this guy digging into the wall like there was no tomorrow.
I was chopping, I don't know, my hand was tight or something, and I pulled and squeezed it straight to the hole, and it was my squeeze.
Others in the elevator took over, and by kicking the drywall, enlarged the hole. Al Smith, the slimmest, went through first.
I was head first, then was shoulders, which was a tight squeeze. Then I hauled back into the elevator for them to push my feet.
All 6 people got out alive by breaking through the weak drywall. For those higher up, that weakness proved fatal. Some safety experts believe that stronger walls might have allowed many more people to get down the stairways.
If the stairs had been more hardened, the walls would be less able to be reached by the collision of the aircraft. Perhaps 1 or 2 of the stairs would have survived the impact, and that would have had people from above maybe couldn't pass through the impact area.
For 6.
Couple of familiar faces on there for you may have heard Jonathan Barnett over the years, Jim Pauls, they're kind of some of the national experts. I'm going to focus real quick on firefighting operations. I know this isn't a big firefighter, so I'm going to spend a lot of time on here, but I just want you to understand kind of what the fire department in New York is up against. One thing is, there's going to be a couple comments that I made that may sound like criticism. Please, they're not intended as criticism. I want to be abundantly clear with that. I have no concept of what they were facing. in retrospect, we can look at it and go, well, they really shouldn't have, or they should have, or none of us have ever been confronted with that, and we make split-second decisions. So please don't take any of my comments as criticism, because they're not intended that way. The fire department was en route to a gas leak a few blocks away. They were diverted there, you saw in the video. Oh, and I apologize for the video. I couldn't get that herky-jerky thing. I thought I had it, and then it quit. Within minutes, they arrived and established a command post. PAPD, which stands for the Port Authority and Police Department, called for the evacuation of the tower. Both towers, for whatever reason, that evacuation order never got carried out. That was another, nobody knows why, but the incident commander from the police department said dump the buildings, and it never was announced to do that. Yes?
Did they say that they had inadequate speakers or
No,
radios?
What was there for the voice evac and alarm system seemed to function good on the floors that were tenable yet. You know, pretty much everything was wiped out. All the infrastructure building was wiped out above the collision. So, although some of them had phones up there yet. So, fire department had dispatched 66 units. They were on a 5th alarm. The command boards were destroyed, so they really didn't know how many firefighters were in or to what level they had gotten in the building. They figured that they were climbing at about 1.5 minutes per floor with the full gear, which to me is still a remarkable time. They did have firefighters communicate at 9:55 that they had reached floor 55 in World Trade Center 2. Fire department did relocate the command center sometime out there, and they had found a working elevator in the 2nd tower. This just kind of shows what they responded with. What I find incredible with this is that New York City Fire Department lost more firefighters on 9/11 than we have on duty in the entire state of Minnesota on any given day, by a lot. And they had responded with almost 1,000 people. We couldn't muster 1,000 firefighters in this state. You get 100 in Minneapolis and 100 in St. Paul, give or take. You know, another maybe a couple dozen in the suburbs. I can't even imagine taking on a task like this, because we just don't have that kind of staffing. What they encountered when they got there was falling objects, debris, body, glass. This is somewhat common in high-rise buildings. I remember talking to Assistant Chief Julie Seal in Minneapolis. Gordy, what was it? The former Cap Tower is down.
1300 Nicollet.
1300 Nicollet. We had a high-rise fire in there a number of years ago, and that was one of the issues they had, was actually glass falling and sheets of glass that come off the building. So that caused a little problem with firefighters, because sometimes it comes right down your hose. And now your water supply is gone, and all, aside from the physical injury part. They had large fires on multiple floors. Most of the occupants couldn't get out. They had people trapped in elevators. They knew that they probably had dead. So not only do you have a fire, you've got an elevator rescue situation, and you're not sure that the elevators are working to get your firefighters up in the building. Sprinkler and standpipe systems were out, basically. Compromise is a nice word. And they had jet fuel in the building. So it was about everything that could go wrong was. What NIST found in interviewing the firefighters who survived it, which I found to be very interesting, was there were operational strategy differences up and down the chain of command. The chief officers, the incident commanders who had witnessed this thing, said, we're going to evacuate those below the impact floor. We're going to focus our attention on getting the people out of the building. Okay? The incident commander wrote off anybody above the floor of impact. In hindsight, 100% correct. Okay? Unfortunately, the operational commanders, the operational directors, had a different philosophy, and that was to get enough resources upstairs to cut a path through the fire and to help people evacuate and rescue people and put the fire out. So there's a disconnect between the chief officers and the sector commanders for somebody to do incident command. The company level officers said, another high-rise fire. maybe a little bigger than most of them would go on, but we're just gonna go up there, put the fire out, help the people out, hopefully be back by lunch. They didn't view this as anything other than it was bigger. They didn't view it substantially different than any high-rise fire that they've been on. And like I said, none of the people interviewed viewed collapse as even a remote possibility. It just wasn't even in the scheme of things. World Trade Center 1 had about 8,900 occupants, give or take. 100% of the occupants on or above the impact zone were killed, 1,555. 107 below the impact zone were killed. 7,400 of the 8,900 escaped, 84%. Now, I'm a glass half full guy, so I go, this is an 84% success. Ain't perfect, but that ain't bad. Could have been a lot worse, and I thought it was going to be a lot worse. Remember, they initially ordered like 30,000 body bags. So a lot of people thought it was going to be a lot worse. 98.5% of the people below the impact zone survived. I'm going to go way out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that the building officials, the fire officials, the design people that were involved in this probably saved more people than the firefighters did. Because I don't think the firefighters actually affected much of a rescue. But the people that designed this stuff into the building, that at least partially worked. Okay. World Trade Center 2 had about 8,600. They're saying now 8,540. It's hard to get an exact count. I don't know if some of you heard on the news today, they found 2 more bodies in an adjacent building that they were demolishing. They found body remains on the roof of an adjacent building. So they're still finding stuff. About 5,700 occupants below the impact zone, about 2,900 above. About 6,900 of them had already evacuated by fairly well into the incident. So 619 of the 637 above the impact zone were killed, 97%. 11 below the impact zone were killed, so it's quite a few less. Here, about 93% of the total occupants escaped. Almost 100% of the occupants below the impact zone escaped. So that, but once again, they had warning. So here's kind of the totals. Tower 1, Tower 2, below the impact zone, they really didn't know where. Location unknown, they really didn't know where. Emergency responders, 421. Fire department took the biggest toll. Police department had 23. Port Authority police had 37. Hospital paramedics. A couple of FBI or ATF people were in there. Volunteer responders. Bystanders or in adjacent buildings, 18 people, 87 on one plane, 60 on another, and 17 people, they don't have no idea where they were at, they were killed. They don't know if they were on the ground, they don't know if they were in the building. They died from it. So there's a summary of the total fatalities. NIST and the construction safety team make 30 recommendations. I'm going to go through a few of them. The one I want to highlight is kind of the sequence of events that they theorized happened. Each aircraft obviously damaged the outside of the building, damaged the inner core, knocked off insulation. The weight was transferred to other columns. The fires grew, initially ignited by the jet fuel, but fed for the most part by the ordinary combustibles. They said, you know, this was primarily cube farms, you know, like the office cube thing with 3 or 4 panel workstations. And all their testing is they kind of burn out in about 20 minutes all by themselves. You can ignite them and burn out. You can go on the NIST website and watch workstations burn up, you know, all the time. The one thing about a workstation, however, this for those of you in the sprinkler business that I find very interesting is, and Chris, if I say something wrong here, jump in, but these workstation fires are incredible rates of heat release. They're up there like 3 to 6 megs, which is a lot. We're putting them out with light hazard sprinklers at 0.1 density. Speaks volumes for I mean, that speaks volumes for a sprinkler system, really. It puts them out. So the fires continue to grow, but for the most part, just by the ordinary combustibles of the building, although they were not at all ventilation controlled fires. The glass is out, that unlimited fuel supply, that unlimited air supply, they're just going to go till they burn the fuel out. The dislodged insulation was primarily responsible for some of the other things that happened here. There's a little difference between the video you saw. Oh, by the way, this was actually put out before the NIST report. How many of you have seen this? This was put out by WGBH Nova. $20 if you got $20 burning a hole in your pocket. You can order it off their website. This was fairly soon after 9/11, so you saw a little conflicting information between NIST and this. One of the things that they theorize is that the bolts let go on the outside panels and these floor trusses fell. NIST is more of the theory that they actually heated up and elongated and therefore pulled those outside wall panels in. It's just a difference in theory. It's kind of the same mechanics, but one happened this way, one happened that way. But NIST theorizes that those floor trusses got heated up, they sagged, that in turn pulled the outside walls in, and that's what eventually caused the failure. They actually did, NIST tried to reconstruct as much of this as they could. For those of you familiar with it, they've developed a lot of the fire modeling stuff came out of NIST, so they had ready access to it, but they reconstructed this. Unfortunately, there's not a test facility in the world that can test a 60-foot long assembly. The effective length is about 50. So they had to build a lot of stuff at half scale in order to run the full scale test. So some of these were done at half scale stuff. But this is what when they put this up and they heated it up to 700 degrees centigrade, they had at the worst point here about a 42-inch downward deflection. So pulling about 3.5 feet down. Okay, so if you're going down 3.5 feet, you know what's attached to has got to be getting pulled in also. For those of you who are not up on your metrics, a quick conversion there, it's about 1,300 degrees at that. Kind of a standard post-flashover compartment fire style temperatures that we see. It's not really unusual temperature. The floor sagging, high temperatures cause the exterior columns to bow inward and buckle, and that spread across the face of the buildings, and then the building collapsed. I want to spend a little time talking about the codes, because this was interesting. The part that I went through was 3 days. It was 20 hours. And I'm condensing that down to about 2 hours here, I think, but an hour and a half, somewhere in there. So I'm cramming a lot of information. But there were some parts of this that, like, they had metallurgical people coming in, and they were talking about how the aluminum on the airplane behaved with the steel and columns and different grades of steel. And I took a trip to Hawaii during the middle of that. That had no bearing. But I found some of the code stuff pretty interesting. One was New York City had its own building code. It has, maybe still does, I'm not sure. They were actually on the 1938 New York City building code when this was designed. The World Trade Center was constructed and owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. If you're familiar with the Port Authority, they are a separate government entity. They were not bound by any local laws or building codes. It's kind of like the U of M or something like that. They're their own jurisdiction. They have their own police department. They also only run the airports in New York and the ports themselves. So they were not bound to follow the New York City building code. Interesting point. They chose to, for the most part. New York City, during the construction phase, was upgrading to adopt the 68 New York City building code. In 1965, the Port Authority directed that the designs follow the soon-to-be adopted code. It was out, and it was out in final enough form. They said, let's use it. It was probably what they call a Class 1B, which in our nomenclature would be a Type 1B construction. Fire-resistant construction, some fire ratings, all non-combustible, but not the highest level of construction. I thought, well, that's interesting that they would follow a yet-to-be-adopted code, but then when I started going into some detail, I thought, oh, I can understand why they want to do this. One is, fire-resistant columns went from 4 hours to 3 hours. Floors went from 3 hours to 2 hours. Anybody know what a stair tower is? It's not a separate stairway, it's even more than that.
Is it an exterior?
It's an exterior, a separate building. The old Department of Ed had them in downtown St. Paul. You actually exited the building and went out into a separate building to get out. That was required by the 1938 New York City Building Code. You would have an atmospheric separation between that. It's not connected to the building. That was required in the 38 code, was not required in the 68 code. The 38 code required 6 exits because it was a high-rise, 6 stairs. The new code only required 3 in high-rises. And the stair width, they would have had to have the 6 stairs, and they would have had to have 44-inch wide doors in the 38 code. Here it wasn't so much how many, but they, just to handle the occupant load of the floors, they would have had to have 2 78-inch wide stairs just for the occupant load. But it was trumped by this that they needed 3 because it automatically because it was a high-rise. But so they put 3 in, but they reduced the size, as we talked about before. The total size was the same, the total width, but they were less than what would be required for the individual.
Do you know how they improved those stairwells between the 93 and 2001? How did they do that?
Primarily lighting and signage. They did the photoluminescent strips on, down, they put more lighting packs in it. Actually, one of the things that they found most valuable in reading this was the presence of flashlights. So it might be, if you work in a high-rise building, you might want to have a flashlight with you. That helped a lot of people out. That was a primary upgrade that was made. Better signage and better identification and the lighting. Unfortunately, one thing they missed is that both of the towers had assembly occupancies on the upper story that had over 1,000 occupants. One of them had a restaurant, one of them had an observation deck. What's significant about over 1,000 people when you come through exit classes?
4 exits.
4 exits now. 4 stairs. Actually, this got missed. NIST is the one that found this. It wasn't even brought up through any of the other part of this. NIST seemed to uncover this. So both towers should have had 4 exits, they didn't. Now the Port Authority argues that the occupant load was so high, that or so low that it was satisfied by the 3, but for those of you who have done fire marshal stuff, that doesn't cut it. Over the years, they've retrofitted with sprinklers. We talked about that. They've upgraded the fireproofing on the steel, new fire command center. The fire alarm system had been upgraded or replaced following the 93. They estimate it was about 80% complete on 9/11. You can read this at your leisure. I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. But one of the findings was the World Trade Centers would likely not have collapsed under the combined effects of the impact and the multi-floor fires if the thermal insulation, the fireproofing, had not been widely discharged or dislodged from the building. They theorized that the building would have withstood this had that fireproofing not been dislodged. That's their principal finding. And they're kind of like, if you had only upgraded one thing in this building that would have had a dramatic difference in terms of the building standing and the collapse, it would have been more fireproofing. They've got some secondary ones, primarily with egress stairs that, gypsum ain't cutting it, that kind of stuff. But they theorize the towers would still be there today had there been enough fireproofing on the steel. For those of us who are sprinkler advocates, that's kind of a little bit of a slap in the face because we want to think of sprinklers as saving everything, but they're saying that this is a series of redundancies and checks and balances, and if you could only do one thing to improve it, that would have done it. Because some of you who are sprinkler designers, could you ever design a sprinkler system to do 10,000 gallons of jet fuel? I suppose you could do a foam extinguishing system, but who's going to
Get an office.
get an office?
I want to test that.
Did they say how much fire insulating?
They theorized that had they had the 1.5 inches on all the structural members, like they should have, even the inch that was originally spec'd, it may have withstood it. problem that they had is even what was spec'd, is you saw how uneven it was installed and applied. And they were, you know, obviously they weren't even following the half-inch spec, so.
What about those retrofitted floors? Did you find any kind of evidence that that lasted longer? Did you find those pieces back in heat?
No, they really weren't able to get into that. One of the other problems that they found is even where they had upgraded it and had the thicker fireproofing, the adhesive qualities of some of the fireproofing is bad, and it may have well been blown off anyway, because it doesn't stick real well, and then it sticks, let me see if I get this right, it sticks better to bare steel than it does to prime steel. They found this, and so they really don't know how well it worked on given floors. They just don't know. So they made 30 recommendations. One of the things that I found interesting in this is, of course, I was sitting at this panel, and I'm an idiot, you know, compared to all these other guys that, you know, run these, you know, they get up at 2 in the morning and run these computer models just for fun. And, you know, Jake Pauls is, you know, probably one of the most intelligent guys I've ever known, but incredibly boring to stand and listen to, and, you know, talks about how people execute a given space and all this other stuff. You know, they're all out there testifying, and I found it interesting. You know, they're criticizing NIST because they said, well, you didn't run enough models to prove this. You know, you didn't prove that this collapse happened exactly at, you know, 46 minutes. You know, you're showing that it happened somewhere between, you know, 45 and 50. You need to get it more concise than that. Right? So at one point, one of the guys from NIST told me that, and Chris, CFD's computational fluid dynamics, the fire model that they're running on this, okay, NIST had networked 16 computers together. Now, knowing NIST, we're not talking about 286 processors. I'm sure they're running state-of-the-art about as fast as available right now. When they would have to enter all the data, they'd have to actually split it up into, each floor was two, you know, a floor would have to be run on 2 computers simultaneously just because the size is so big, because they break it up into what, 1 inch by 1 inch cubes or whatever.
It depends on, yep.
But, you know, and they input all the data, and then they run this thing, and it's 16 computers networking together, and it would take days to run each simulation. You hear these engineers say, well, you should have changed this variable by 10%, and they're going, we could be running models till the cows come home. I mean, 16 computers networked together that would run for days to get one data set out of it. And basically, they proved within 10% that this is exactly what would have happened. They were able to recreate this scenario within a few minutes of collapse. They had enough on the steel. They know about when the steel was going to fail. And within minutes, they matched this situation all over. I thought, gee, it sounds good to me, but all these engineers are there, well, you really should have run this with this variable. And I see this output was 1.45, and it should have been 1.48. How would you even know that, you know? But anyway, some people have way too much time on their hands. I thought NIST did an excellent job on it. I disagree with a couple of their findings, but 98% of it, they were right on the money. They made about 30 recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them are specific to the iconic type high-rise structures. Others could apply to more run-of-the-mill type buildings, even the single-story building. One is enhanced fire resistance for structures. We talk about redundant fire protection systems. So you got into this sprinkler system and you took it out in one place and you took it out. You know, so they're saying, you know, you really maybe need to look at some redundancy. Are there 2 water supplies? Are there you know, 2 alarm risers? You know, what do you got going on in here? Because they don't want one event to take it out. It's like the little alarms on it. Well, we're doing a 4-wire. Yeah, but you're running it all through the same conduit in the same place. I mean, if my sidecar goes through one, it's probably going to go through all 4 conductors. So, you know, you really have to think about it. Is there really 2 loops here? Allowing for full evacuation prior to collapse. I'm going to put that as a performance spec. We're going to be able to get everyone out of here before this thing's going to come down. It may come down. I'm not saying it's never going to come down. Sufficient structural resistance to withstand a collapse, at least at some point, at least a localized collapse. Compartmentation not to exceed 12,000 square feet to try to hold the fire in check. One of my favorites, the standards that all this is based on are over 100 years old. The ASTM E119 time temperature curve, sorry, it has no reality to real world fire conditions in my book. I've argued that for years. Came out in 1904, 1906, something like that, based on a wood crib fire. Yeah, we got a lot of those. You know, we're talking about plastics now, and they got this nice time temperature curve. Our time temperature curve is like that. You know. Test methods that are more representative of real fire conditions. Performance as far as thickness, adhesion, life expectancy of the fireproofing. How even do you have to put it on there? You know, can you just glob it on here? It's 2 inches thick there and a ½ inch thick there. Does that equal an inch? You know, 'cause that's how it's done now. Really, that's how it's done now. Develop performance objectives to allow fire burnout without collapse, either localized or structural. New fire-resistant coating materials. We haven't done a lot in that area. There's been a lot for the openings, you know, putting fire caulk in the holes, but they haven't really done a lot for structural fireproofing. It's, you know, it's not that many products out there. Do, in fact, some of these construction materials that we're using that are important for fire resistance, do they really perform as intended? I thought it was a very good question. Most of us who have had firefighting experience say, it ain't working as they're preaching that it's going to work. Like I said, the 2-hour wall isn't holding for 2 hours. You know, you did some tests a number of years ago with solid panel doors, and you got about 10 minutes out of them. The code would say 20. Yeah. Why don't we develop fire alarm and communication systems that provide continuous, reliable, and accurate information about the status of life safety system? We're sophisticated enough now with the electronics. That panel could be continuously sending back, oh, another detector went off here. It could be very graphical. You can see exactly where that fire was developing inside the building. We're not talking about, you know, technology that's out of the realm of present day. Active fire protection systems need more reliability. My favorite, smoke management systems. Personal opinion, there's 2 types, the ones that fail when you put them in, the ones that fail later. They don't work. I've never seen one work as advertised yet. So if somebody gets one, invite me. I'd love to come see one. I haven't seen it yet. Alarm systems should be upgraded to allow for information to be sent back to emergency responders. They make tactical decision-making observations. Boy, that's a radical concept. All this expensive alarm equipment in there, and all it does is buzz for occupants. It really isn't interfacing very well for the fire department. Examine and evaluate certain trade-offs. Are they appropriate? Type of construction, we trade that off if it's sprinkled. I'm an advocate for sprinklers, but maybe at a point we don't do that anymore. Life safety and egress. Boy, here's one of my big ones. Right now, the building and fire code that we adopted in Minnesota allows you to trade off egress within a sprinkler building. This is a sprinkler building. Egress was not adequate. Maybe that's a bad decision. Egress systems should be designed to accommodate full evacuation and to contemplate counterflow, or build in a separate stairway just for emergency responders. Get elevators to work. You need to know. At least in fire conditions, we need to get. We got people in these buildings. We need a way to get them out. When you got disabled, mobility impaired, or even somebody in the 100th floor of the building, going downstairs, they proved this twice now, is just not a viable option. You know, it's 7 hours in the 93 bombing, or it's the building falls down on you in the 2001. So I like this one. Train architects and fire protection engineers in structural engineering principles, and conversely, train architects and structural engineers in fire protection principles.
Well, you're thinking way out of the box.
Part of this wasn't mine. This is part of one of your classes when you're going through the engineering program is to have a class in one of these other disciplines. You understand what they're dealing with. They understand what you're dealing with. Develop and practice fire evacuation practice and procedures. Maximize remoteness of egress. Maintain the functional integrity, harden them up. Don't allow things like gypsum in some of these buildings where that stair tower is absolutely critical to get people out of. Improved and standardized signage. Avoid unexpected deviations, transfer hallways.
What were those for anyway?
To maximize space, because they'd get a tenant that wanted so much space unimpeded. So they moved the stairway for them so they could have their extra 5,000 square feet or whatever openness. Make egress systems more intuitive. Boy, that's one of my favorites. Is it because most egress is not intuitive? How many of you pay attention to exit signs? And where do we put exit signs?
Right.
What's wrong with that picture? Are there better ways, like we do on airplanes? A bunch of strobing on the floors? Maybe. You can read the conclusions, but they're long. Anybody have any questions? Comments, complaints? Gordy?
Have we had any building collapses from fire that was not caused by airplanes hitting buildings or bombs? Or do we have, it seems to me we've got a history where generally the buildings hold up fairly well, except for unusual conditions. And can we plan for these unusual conditions?
It depends, because as a fire investigator for a couple of years, I can tell you, I've been to enough fires where there was structural collapse afterwards. Now, a total building collapse, no.
Los Angeles burned 4 stories, in Philadelphia fire burned for 18 hours. I think they tore down Philadelphia.
Although LA, I talked to the fire marshal for LA, they actually had they called a structural engineer out on the first interstate bank. Had him there and said, what's going to happen?
Sure.
And he was providing advice at the time, like, well, you got about this long and then you better get out of there. But, even though the buildings might have survived, I don't know how usable they'd have been. I mean, my thinking is they had to chop the top of them off and do something after they were done. I'm not an architect or engineer, but it doesn't seem to me that they would have been very functional after that. So, we've had partial collapses. I don't know that we've had total structural collapses. I mean, eventually they'll come down. I mean, Station Nightclub burned down eventually. Yeah. There was just a couple of walls left when that was done. So, obviously we burn houses down all the time, literally in the parking lots. So, it can happen, but not that kind of a progressive collapse. You don't typically see that.
Yeah, the structural engineer, Robertson, I think his name was, he said they had planned for the largest airplane at that time. Now, how do you plan for something in the future when you can't see
and that's one thing that NIST didn't even make any bones about it. We're not trying to say that you have to design a building for an airplane pad. They were never making that assertion. But they were making an assertion that you do need to do more, possibly in a high-rise building, than a 1,500 square foot sprinkler design. You need to look at some other scenarios other than the typical.
Are they going to do anything on the Pentagon? Because that had a fire that raged for 2 days underneath the roof membrane and kept burning around the building and they couldn't stop it.
Yeah, I haven't heard much on the Pentagon itself, and of course, they'll never do an investigation like this because the building itself is so secretive. They don't want to release floor plans and that kind of stuff. I understand, and there they had some, I talked to the chief, there was on an NFPA committee with him, and they actually had bomb blast doors that came shut. Unfortunately, they probably caused some people to be stuck in a compartment with a fire who in a normal building could have gotten out. So, it protected the building and probably protected some other occupants. There were others who were sacrificed because of that. They were on the wrong side of the door when it closed. There was no opening door. I don't think you'll see any large-scale investigation in the Pentagon because the building itself behaved fairly well, considering that impact.
Are any of the other tall buildings in the country, Sears, some of the other ones, Pan Am, are they being looked at now? And Anything contemplated on those to retrofit those, or?
I would suspect, a lot of those they've already retrofitted with sprinklers and they had alarm systems because that was part of the whole highways package. I would suspect, the same 9/11, there was a threat at the Sears Tower at the same time, so I would assume the owners of Sears Tower took it to heart and had done something. They were probably next on the hit list.
Yeah, the White House was.
Being an iconic building like it is.
Right.
So, I would think most of, all of the building owners and managers were at the same, they were writing the same thing, and they were making a lot of comments there at the same time. They didn't like, obviously, some of the recommendations. It was modified the way they use buildings.
Because a lot of those buildings were built around the same time frame of years. So I kind of wonder if some of those buildings don't incorporate some of the same design philosophy that went into those buildings.
I understand the one that's under design right now somewhere in Southeast Asia. The other one that's being built that's supposed to be bigger than that. They tried to incorporate some of it. Where was it? Yeah, okay. Now, they've looked at things even more radical, like outside slides. But I'm like,
under the floor is down. Going to be around for a few minutes, in case anybody has any other questions. John will be around for a few minutes while we're packing up the stuff. And I think on behalf of everybody, I certainly like to thank you for a very thorough discussion about this issue. And we've all learned something again tonight, as we do in most of our meetings, I think. And thank you very much for being here.